Today we shall examine argument by analogy. Analogy is a source of evidence. What is argument by analogy? Argument by analogy is a type of argument where one infers if two things are alike in certain ways, then they are alike in other ways as well. If two or more than two things have similarities in some respects, then they have similarities in other respects as well. Um, we use analogy in our everyday arguments, in legal judgments, in ethical and scientific debates. But are they reliable? Are they good evidence? Well, we need to evaluate the strength of analogical argument. Some analogical argument may be good, some can be weak. So we need to weigh the strength of their argument. We need to evaluate the quality of arguments by analogy. How? We need to ask certain questions before we rely on argument by analogy. So first we need to be aware of two important things in order to identify whether the argument involves analogy. Number one, if the argument uses a familiar object and it uses the similarity between the familiar and the unfamiliar object to arrive at the conclusion about the unfamiliar object. Okay, I'm restating this. An analogical argument uses a familiar object or situation in order to conclude something about the unfamiliar object or situation. Okay, let me exemplify this. Brain is like a computer. Human brain is like a computer. We know a computer receives information, process, saves and restore data. Alright, so like this, human brain also receives information, process information, retain them and also retrieve data, retrieve information. Therefore, human brain is like computer. So here two things. One familiar thing is computer, and based on the similarities between brain and computer, it is concluded that brain functions like computer. One important thing one has to remember that sometimes the relationship is not between the object themselves but how they function or how they work. Okay, so in the case of brain computer analogy, the resemblance is between how brain and computer function, not between the objects themselves, not between the things brain and computer. So resemblance is used as evidence. So first of all, we need to ask the question, what are the elements that are being compared to each other? Second question is, what are the similarities? Are the similarities relevant to support the conclusion? Here in the brain computer analogy, the similarities, how they function, the similarities regarding the function between brain and computer support the conclusion that brain is like computer because brain functions like computer. Next question is, are there any significant difference between the two situation or object? If we miss a key difference between two situation, then it cannot support the conclusion. If the similarity is on the superficial level and significant difference is being missed, overlooked, then it cannot lead to conclusion, to justify, validate the conclusion. For example, um, governance is like business, because both manages resource. So both governance and business manage resource. That is why governance is just like business. This is an analogical argument, but the analogical argument is not good. It's not strong analogical argument. It's an instance of weak analogy. Here, the comparison between governance and business is on the superficial level, because the similarity states that both manages resource. That is why they are similar. But governance is more than business. It involves public welfare, taxation, defense, and many more. So there are key differences which has been ignored, which has not been which have not been counted in the analogy. So analogy is on the superficial level. And the third question that we need to ask, does the analogy oversimplify the complex situation? Yeah, in the case of business governance analogy, this oversimplifies the complex governance. And the next question is, does the analogy fit into the context? That you need to take into account. Finally, we need to see, does the analogy, since the analogy is meant for clarifying or explaining or persuading a particular thing, why do we use analogy? We use analogy in order to clarify an issue or explain a very complex thing. In teaching profession, sometimes you may notice that teachers use analogy in order to explain very complicated issue in simplest terms. So it is a helpful tool to make complex things understandable easily. So we need to ask question whether the analogical argument able to persuade, clarify, or explain the subject that is meant to be explained. Next and final thing is, does the analogical argument establish the conclusion? Does the analogical argument support the conclusion? So these are the questions that we need to raise in order to evaluate the strength of the analogy used in the argument. Until and unless we examine the quality of the analogy, how relevant the similarities between the two situations, whether the two situation misses important differences, whether the analogy is appropriate for this context. Okay, is the analogy able to clarify, explain, or clarify or explain the subject under discussion? Is this analogy able to support the conclusion? So these are the questions that we need to address before we rely on the analogical argument. And the more similarities between the two things, target and source. Target is the subject that is to be discussed, and the source is the familiar object based on which we intend to explain the subject. The more the similarities between them, the more reliable the analogical argument.